After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and the Spanish opening is on the board. Black now goes on with f5 as discussed in previous videos. As we went through d3, d4, and all the more solid and main moves, another one that is interesting and is one of the most popular moves is knight to c3 already. Now this is actually very tricky and very dangerous. Of course, it looks like a good move because it develops a piece. White is one step away from castling. It's not like he's going through disaster. So he has to be taken into account. The next move now is take the pawn in e4. Now obviously here the knight will have to take back. Before we go through knight takes back, let's see what happens after bishop takes knight. I've encountered this move a lot, so we're going to look at this very briefly. Obviously taking the knight in f3 means white can take back with the bishop. So the best move is to take with the b pawn. This is thematic. When the Spanish bishop takes you in c6, doubling your pawns with the b pawn, then you're just going to play d5 and you're going to have the 3 pawns. It's a very strong center. And now after the knight recaptures the pawn in e4, d5. So black is already better. Black has the bishop pair. It didn't come at any cost at all. A move like knight g5 to save the knight is punished immediately because the knights are defending each other, but one of them is attackable with the pawn. So that means you're going to win the knight. If queen pins the pawn, then queen e7. You're out of trouble. And in this position, also another quick mention will be knight to c3, but this is just, we're out of theory. It's just, white is just worse. And the white knight will have to go back. It doesn't make sense. Black will have perfect development. Bishop d6, queen going to f6. The pawn will control f3 and d3 for a long time. We've seen this position in the previous videos, a very similar position, so you can take it from there. Let's go on a few moves to see how to react to this specific move. Knight d4 looks very active and the knight looks fine. It's attacking the pawn. So queen to f6 is the move now. It's attacking the knight. The knight cannot be defended by a pawn. So after knight to e2, bishop to c5, doubling up the attack on the knight. These are all forced moves. Of course, the knight cannot go to b3 because you got double attack on f2 and the game is over. So after c3, defending, knight to h6, continuing development, and most importantly, attacking the square g4. This is crucial. White doesn't get out of trouble. After castling, it's just too late. Black plays this incredible move, bishop to a6, pinning the knight. If you're in the mood of giving away the bishop pair for the opponent's 2 knights, I don't think we can be friends. But you can also have ideas of like taking the knight in d4, and after the pawn takes back, you can take the knight in e2 with a winning a pawn in d4. Excellent position. But the game can go so much worse than this. Not only like up in material position and center in that case. Let's look at knight to b3. It looks like now it's possible to be played. Black simply retreats to d6, and this is soon to be over because black can create weaknesses. We've seen this type of position many times in my videos. For example, queen to e5 with a threat of checkmate. The pawn cannot push to d3 or to d4, for example, because you'd have double attack over the d3 square. I have no idea why the arrows are red instead of green this time. But anyway, just to tell you how wrong things can go, a move like rook to e1 now with the idea of unpinning this knight and maybe play knight g3, knight f4, playing it safe. Well, not knight f4 immediately, but maybe g3. The game is completely over after bishop takes. It's a sacrifice. There's going to be too much attack. King moving to h1 means you can play a move like queen h4 with discover threats that win the game. King moving doesn't make sense. Just pinning the knight. You can play knight g4 anyway. King taking the bishop still gives birth to this scenario. Knight check, and then it's basically like a great gift. Position is evaluated at -10, so you can take it from there. And now let's close this line, this specific variation, by showing the last line. So bishop b5, f5, and knight c3. Okay, we take the pawn. And we're looking at when the bishop takes the knight. The last line I'm going to show is, well, take back, of course. And now white takes the pawn in e5. The idea is the usual queen to h5. The arrows are back to be green for some reason. This move is wrong. Knight e5 is wrong because it's punished immediately by queen to g5. Thematic move. You're putting pressure on g2, also on the knight. Of course, knight taking in d5 doesn't work because of queen takes knight in e5 for free. There's no nasty attacks of the queen in h5 here. There's nothing of that sort of stuff. So now the best move according to the engine is knight to g4, which saves a little bit of both the pawn in g2 and cannot be taken. So black now goes on with the obvious d5, putting a pawn in the center, we have this amazing center and also double attack on the knight, which means that a move like d3 or d4 with a discovered attack on the queen doesn't work because you're going to take the knight with the queen, you got double attack on it. So after h3 protecting the knight, h5 kicking the knight away, the only move will be knight to e3, but then d4. And you're going to a comfortable endgame up in material. Oh, and by the way, you might be wondering what happens after the knight e4 move, taking the pawn and attacking the queen. Simply queen to g6, the attack on the knight remains, whilst the attack on the other knight also remains. So from the start, I've got actually one more line to show, and then I can move on to the main topic of the video. So after f5 and knight c3, we said we take the pawn, and now we're looking at the variation bishop takes immediately. Okay, we take back, and now we're going to look at knight takes e4. Now this is just very similar to previous scenarios. You know what to do, d5. Earlier we went through knight moving back and so on, but let's look what happens at this very tricky move, knight takes e5, giving up the knight. Now don't be scared, because this is not supposed to work. Don't take the knight, of course, because queen h5 would be really annoying to meet. The move now is queen to e7, pinning these two pieces to the king. The best move by white is d4, but just so you know, the game is already compromised. Black is winning. I think the position is evaluated around as if black was up a piece. Well, as a matter of fact, you can see that that's going to happen because we have an attack on the knight in e4 as well. Let's look at this annoying move immediately. Queen to h5 check. You just attack the queen, and now there's just too much attack everywhere. Of course, knight taking g6 doesn't work because you can take this knight with check and then also take this knight. You're taking everything. So here now the move that you might have been thinking was queen to g5, because you have an attack on the knight in e4, right? So if you take the queen in g5, you get taken back, and white is fine. If you take the queen, you get taken back. You can't take this knight because you get taken. But the move here very quietly is this one, d takes. So don't panic, and you're up a piece. No compensation whatsoever. In this position, one more mention. As we know, we have to play queen e7, and after white's best move, which is d4, we take the knight. Now white can play queen to h5 check, and after pawn to g6, which is our best move, knight to g6 is a little bit different from before when the white player hadn't sacrificed the knight in e4 yet, because now we cannot really give a check with the queen, not a useful check at least, and the threat is still going on. Black goes on with knight f6, thematic moves, nothing to worry. And now two moves are possible, either the knight takes the queen or the queen moves away. If queen moves away, then you've got the brilliant queen to g7. This is beautiful. You threaten to win the knight for free, so after knight takes the rook, finally queen to g2, attacking the rook. Only move will be rook to f1 to save the rook, but now bishop to a6, and at best the white player will be checkmated in as many as 6 moves. The pawn in e4 cannot be taken. The knight, well, it's pointless to take the knight because you got double attack on the rook, so you got a checkmate coming. And in this position, instead of queen h4, what happens after knight takes queen? Well, obviously we take the queen back, but black is up a piece. There's nothing here. Obviously, exchanging pieces will be even easier for black. So let's say after knight takes c6, it can be argued that white's got way more pawns than us. We got 4, white has 7. But still, rook to g8 now, putting pressure on the pawn. White cannot castle because of bishop h3. So after g3, bishop to b7, putting the bishop on the glorious diagonal. So after, well, there's nothing here. If knight moves, then simply e3 is too strong to meet. If d5 to protect it, to protect the knight, then knight f6 attacking the pawn. No way to stop this. If white really wants to hold that pawn by playing c4, then in that case you take the knight. Pawn takes back, and now castle long, playing the endgame with an extra piece. The idea, obviously, well, white playing a3 in order to push b4 and try to activate the queen side, still just doesn't help. Rook d6, it was going to be impossible for the white player to protect the c6 pawn. Yeah, and then you go into the endgame with an extra piece. So from the start, now we're going to look at the other line, the main topic of the video. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, f5. What happens after knight c3? We said we take the pawn, and now knight takes back. So that's the move we're going to go through. Black goes on with knight f6. So we still give white the possibility to take that knight in c6 and then go for the pawn. But let's see what happens now. The first move we'll go through is queen to e2, defending the knight. And also putting virtually double pressure on e5, meaning that after take and take back, and after all of the swaps, then the white player might take e5 with the queen and simplify everything and go a pawn up for the endgame, which will be really a problem. Okay, black goes on with pawn to d5, controlling the center, just like we've seen in previous examples. And after knight to f6 check, we have to take with the pawn. This is crucial because taking with the queen just allows the white player to take in e5, and our knight in c6 is pinned. So now we take with the pawn, and it looks weird, but now that's how we go on. Now the best move by white, according to the engine, is d4, putting more pressure over e5, so we push the pawn in e4. And after knight to h4, moving away, since we were planning to play queen to e7, I'm pinning the pawn in e4 and forcing the knight to move anyway. Black goes on with queen to e7. After castling, bishop to g7. It's a weird move. It's a weird development, actually, because we have this backward pawn in f6, but nothing stops us from playing f5, because in this type of game, when you have a pawn in e4 and white cannot place a knight in f3, obviously, then you might as well just push f5. After white's best move, which is c4, trying to attack the center, undermining the control of the center that we have, now we can castle. It's pretty surprising, but our development is now complete. Our king doesn't look any safe. The fire is literally open. And also we're giving away one of our central pawns with an attack on the knight. What are we going to do now? Obviously knight to d4. After queen to c4, to save the bishop, since we're attacking the bishop, black continues with f5. This bishop has become a monster. This bishop is about to become stronger, and we're going to win the bishop pair no matter what. Now obviously the bishop can't go to a4 in order to preserve the bishop pair, because you have an attack on the knight in h4. After the best move by white, which is bishop to e3, because you don't really have anywhere to put this knight, that makes sense. So bishop to e3, doubling the attack on the knight in d4. We take the bishop first, and then either way we are up a piece. By the way, in this position, we went through what happens after castling. What happens if, and you're wondering what's the point of playing queen e2 variation and moving the knight to h4? Well, what happens after queen h5 check? Don't be alarmed because of this. It's a silly variation, queen to f7, and you're just fine. And now the white player doesn't really have anywhere to put the queen unless he wants to go all the way back, but then we're just developing bishop g7, castle, maybe all of the things we're going to do. We're also threatening, as soon as we castle, we're also threatening d4. If white takes our knight, we can take back. We have the very similar structure to the one we've seen before. It's really good for black. So after queen takes and king takes, of course castling now would be wrong, because after knight to d4 with an attack on the bishop and the pawn and winning a pawn is completely winning for black. So after c3 now, how do we meet this type of move? Black plays knight to e7. So remember, when you have a knight in c6 against the Spanish, right, you're putting, at least the Spanish, when you play the Schliemann Gambit, you're playing this, you're attacking this pawn in d4 as we've seen in this video and also in previous videos. If they take you, it's fine, because you can take back, and we've seen this really nice center. If they don't take you and they play c3, the goal of the knight, which is to put pressure on d4, is nullified. Now, of course, there's no point in being taken, so knight to e7 is the best move. And after castle, knight to g6, rerouting the knight towards the king side, because that's where it's useful to be in the first place. And most importantly, the white player can't really save this knight. Like, horrible, obviously. You can just take the knight and the king looks terrible. You still have the bishop pair. You're going to be exposing the opponent king, making it very weak. So after knight takes knight, when pawn takes back, we have a very strong rook. We're doing just fine. A move like f3 to challenge this incredible center that we have is met with bishop to d6, coming with a priority attack. And after f4, stopping all of that, bishop to g4, finishing development and preparing the rooks to double up. You can double them up anywhere you want. It's going to be too much attack on it, and the bishop cannot be removed from this square, because if h3 happens, boom, you can take the pawn in h3 with the bishop. The attack is just too strong. Pawn takes back and rook h3. There's no way to stop this. So let's say white's best move, I think position is evaluated around -2. White's best move will be king to f2, trying to find a shelter somehow on the queen side. After rook, the other rook to h8. A move like bishop e3 will just lose because of rook check. And when the king moves to e1, you can take the bishop. If the king moves to e2, then rook check, infiltrating. And when the rook blocks, Then rook f takes in f2, even more surprisingly, because after bishop takes back, now you can play c6, attacking the bishop. The only move will be bishop to a4, and now taking the pawn in f4 with the bishop gives us 3 passed pawns, far stronger than one bishop. Positions evaluated around -4, if as long as I remember. So in this position we went through bishop e3 and how to punish it. What happens after the white king tries to keep escaping, let's say king e1. Black now plays f5, solidifying the center that we have. This time positions evaluated around -2, assuming that white would play only the best moves, computer moves. Here the plan is to play rook to g3. Well, c6 is always a good move to attack the bishop. The bishop moves away, and then you play rook to h2. The bishop will no longer control the e2 square. And even if the bishop, after going to a4, will go to d1, black plays bishop to e7. The opponent king can never cross the second rank, because that's where we are with the rook. The rook can never challenge any of our rooks because we will take it for free. This bishop can't develop anywhere that makes sense. And our idea now, of course, is to play the winning bishop to h4. So we'll stop the line there. So from the start, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, and now f5. We're looking at knight c3 in this video. We take the pawn. And after knight takes back, now we play knight to f6. So what happens if white now takes the knight? This is now looking a bit better, because after we take back with the b pawn, it looks like white can actually play knight e5, because now obviously queen e7 will be the move. But unlike the previous examples, this time the white player still has a move knight takes knight in f6 that comes with check. However, this doesn't help. Knight f6 check, we take back with the pawn, and this knight is pinned, so we're winning a piece. Queen h5 does nothing here, because after the king moves to d8, the knight cannot jump to f7, making the winning fork, because it's pinned, and you're gonna take it no matter what. You're up a piece with no compensation whatsoever. Oh, and by the way, don't be tricked by d4. Now don't take the knight straight away, because if you do, bishop g5 wins for white. That's pretty obvious. So your best move here is rook to g8. Don't worry, because the knight in e5 is still pinned. You're going to take a next move. The rook in g8 obviously is there to put more defense over the square g5, preventing the arrival of the bishop. And in this position, earlier we went through knight taking with check. What happens after d4? Now here we don't take the knight in e4 with our knight. Best move is simply d6. And this knight is pinned. Obviously we've seen what happens after knight f6 check. We can just take, and the knight in e5 is pinned. We're going to take that one too. So let's look at this very nice idea. Bishop to g5. I've encountered this move a lot. What happens next? Well, the reason is simple. After you take the knight in e5, you couldn't have taken the knight in e4 because the bishop was pinning it. The white player might do this move. Knight takes with check. We have to take back with the pawn. But there's nothing here. Queen h5 check. Now we block with the queen. There's this piece hanging too, so white will have to swap and have to take. We are simply up a bishop. Bishop to e3, we take the pawn in d4, quite surprisingly, because now we have an isolated pawn in f6 and a double isolated pawn on the c file. But this actually makes our advantage even greater. Bishop takes, now bishop b4 check. And this is amazing, because we're going to be involving both bishops. After c3, for example, well, now simply bishop to d6, calming down. There's no advantage for white. White is up a pawn. It's got better structure, but our extra piece and the fact that we have the bishop pair should be enough to win this game. So let's look at one more line from the same variation. So f5, knight c3. Okay, we take, and now take back. Knight to f6. Okay, what happens when they take our knight now? We take with the b pawn. What happens if queen e2 comes now? Okay, well, obviously d5. Then after knight takes back in f6 check, pawn takes back. It's a very similar scenario as the one we've seen a few minutes ago. White's best move is d4. But let's look at this variation, which we haven't seen. Knight takes pawn in e5. Nothing to worry here as well, although I've encountered this as well. Well, take the knight, and after queen to h5 check, king to d7 is the key move. Make sure you don't lose this pawn with the check, because the queen will be attacking the rook. So after king to d7, although queen to e5 check, you could have been met in this specific situation, could have been met with queen e7, and you're pinning the opponent queen, so nothing to worry. Queen to e5 now, for example, winning the pawn is just met by queen e7, and you're going to the endgame with an extra piece. So in this position, as mentioned, the best move is d4 and e4. is thematic. What happens after castling? Since the pawn is pinned, earlier we went through variations like knight h4, but it wasn't the same variation because we had the knight in c6 and a bishop that was pinning it. In this variation, white just castles, knowing that the pawn in e4 is pinned, but this is just punished with bishop to g4. However, you're not completely winning yet because you can't move the pawn, and after queen to e3, which is the best move, black plays the best move, king to d7. Boom! It's so beautiful because the king is actually looking unsafe, but it's extremely safe behind all of these pawns in the close center. So in this position, after knight h4, black plays f5. And now again, we have a discovered attack on the knight. Moving g3 to save the knight is just terrible for the pawn structure in front of the opponent king. We still have the bishop pair and the light square bishop. Instead of what happens after h3, counter-attacking them, we just take the knight. We're completely winning here after the opponent takes the piece back. Black plays bishop to d6 with a threat. Of course, g3 to stop that is silly because queen to g4. Black is completely winning. You're going to play h5. The black king is extremely safe. And not even a move like queen h3 seems to be actually working because you can just take the queen, pawn takes back, and after rook a to g8, black is inevitably going to win material because the pawn is pinned and you're going to open the files. f3 doesn't work to stop that because you can just take it and rook takes back. Position is evaluated around -350 or something like that. There's a crucial pawn to win and our rooks are much better placed. So from the start, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6 and bishop e5, f5, knight c3, okay, we're taking this pawn, knight takes back, and now knight f6. What happens after d3? The most boring, but of course the best move by white, the most, well, logical. Okay, now d5. Now we're attacking that knight. We're asking a serious question to that knight. What do you want to do? Do you want to hang around at your place or at my place? So in the variation where, and I've encountered this a lot and I promise it's really tricky, the white player might choose to leave the knight in e4. We're going to go through knight takes knight in f6, but let's look at this very briefly. Knight takes in e5, very tricky. Now here you don't play queen e7, obviously, because knight c6, bishop c6 is going to be double attack on that square. So you just take the knight in e4. Just like white ignored the knight in e4 being attacked by a pawn, you're also ignoring the double attack on c6. So how to continue? It might be a nightmare if you encounter this yourself. So now you know what to do. White now takes the knight in c6, and of course taking back means bishop takes e6 with an attack on the rook and so on. Now the key move is queen to d6, because if you think about it, this knight doesn't have any effective discover attacks. So if the knight moves to d4 or e5 or b4, it's always going to be checked wherever he goes. It's always going to be checked by the bishop, but none of these checks are actually harmful. So by the way, all of these checks also you actually going to get taken by the queen. So after knight to a5, does white get to win material? No, because c6 attacking the bishop, and after the bishop moves, b6 attacking the knight, and after knight to b3, b5, and black is up material. Oh, and by the way, in this position, after c6 attacking the bishop, if the bishop goes to a4, you've got queen check, making a fork to these two. So if c3, you take the knight, and if bishop to d2, you can take the bishop. So back at this position, the white player has just recaptured the pawn in e4. We took the knight out to f6, and now d3. Okay, as mentioned, we go to d5, and earlier we went through knight takes e5 and everything that happens next. It's a crazy variation. Not as crazy as the guy from the Netflix show You. The line we're going to look at now is knight takes in f6 instead of knight e5. Okay, we take back the pawn, and after castle, bishop to g4. This was the most solid choice of the white player in the knight c3 game against the Schliemann Gambit. So this is white having played the absolute best moves so far and preserving the bishop pair, keeping a nice pawn structure and creating some weakness of, well, not really a weakness, but some exposure to our king. Nothing to worry though. After h3, removing the pin, attempting to remove the pin, well, you keep it with bishop to h5. And the thing is that in this specific game, when your opponent has a pawn in d3, that means the bishop cannot go back to e2, especially because d4 cannot happen due to the very powerful e4 move. So that means our bishop is there to make a pin forever. What happens in the variation when they play g4? Really desperate to remove the pin. Well, okay, now the stunning queen to d7 happens. And look how amazingly we are developed. The black player can play a move like bishop to d7, long castle, rook to g8. All of these moves can come very quickly and with threats either way. With threatening, we have double attack over g4. So if the white player accepts the sacrifice pawn to h5, how do we continue this? Simply queen to h3. And now white playing the best moves is still completely pointless. You got rook g8 coming, is too strong to be met. So after the best move by white, which is knight to g5, in beautiful sacrifice, because if you take back with the pawn, then you don't have an open file anymore. Now black plays rook to g8, pinning the knight. Best move by white is d4, which allows the bishop to come into play. Also allows queen to d3 potential idea. Black plays e4, stopping all of that from happening. And black is going to recapture the knight in g5 with a tremendous attack going on. A move like bishop to f4 with the idea of closing up the king side or helping at least for the moment. Doesn't work because of bishop to h6. We have now so much attack and only one defender. If instead white plays bishop takes knight with check, pawn takes back, those are computer moves. Even after queen to e2, simply long castle. Look, the torture of pinning this knight for a long time and never taking it. There's no way out of this. f3 now, still the best moves, bishop to h6. We've got so much attack over that knight. And after queen to g2, how to go about now? Queen to h5. What a torture. With not swapping anything, even though we'd be going to a comfortable endgame. That's the best move. After queen check, queen g4 check, queen takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, rook takes. Still, all of the best moves have been played, but black will go on with 2 rooks against 2 rooks, but 2 extra pawns for the winning endgame. So another line we're going to look at before we close this video is going to be the one with bishop b5, f5, knight c3, and we said we take the pawn, knight takes back, and now knight f6. So we're looking at the d3 move, which is met with d5. Now knight back to c3. This is not a move I want to take seriously because it shouldn't be taken that seriously, because the white player has just wasted a tempo and it has given black better developing chances. It doesn't make sense for white to play like that. But let's say what happens. Let's talk about a little bit of the themes that there are behind. Bishop to d6 now comes, and after castle, how is it that the black is already minus 150 more or less on the evaluation? But this is because of the lack of freedom for the white player. Think about it. This knight isn't going anywhere targeting this pawn because it's protected by the bishop. This knight can't take this pawn because of our knight. The bishop taking in our knight just means we take back and we have a better center. The pawn in d3 stops the bishop from being able to go back. d4 will be met with the thematic e4, and that's better for black. And there's nowhere that makes sense to place this bishop. For example, bishop to g5. This is not good because any capture here will just help us develop. And now we meet this move with knight to e7. And the idea, of course, is to play c6. You'll see how to take the game from here. If queen to e2, putting more pressure over e5, just play c6. There's attack on the bishop, so bishop a4. And now bishop to g4. It's already game over for white. h3 is met with bishop h5, and this is a pin that can never be stopped. Remember, when your opponent has a pawn in d3 and the white bishop, the light square bishop that cannot go back to e2 to put extra protection to the knight, then the pin is just too strong. And what is white going to do? He can never really go on the diagonal of this knight. Playing g4 here is not possible either because knight takes in g4, pawn takes back, and then bishop takes back. It's too much attack on the knight and it cannot be defended again, so black is completely winning. So here you might be arguing, what happens after bishop takes knight first in order to play g4 for real? Then rook takes, and now again we have double attack on this knight. We're gonna double up and isolate the pawn in front of the opponent king. g4 doesn't help because of the stunning knight to g6 move, ignoring the bishop now that is hanging. Boom, this is beautiful. What is the knight gonna do? Well, if white wins the piece, then knight to f4 attacks the queen. The queen will have to move. Best move is queen to e3, but still knight to h3 comes with check. If king to e2, h2, then pawn up e4, then this is a discovered check. Taking the knight is a suicide after rook takes f3 check. You're making a fork, you're winning the queen. And even if the white player had gone to h1 instead of h2 to protect from discovered attack, then simply rook to f5 with an idea of taking h5. Position is evaluated around -7, so you can imagine And one last thing I'm going to mention in this position, after knight just moved to e7, what happens if white plays the preemptive and extremely annoying h3, stopping the whole bishop g4 idea? Okay, c6 comes anyway, bishop moves to a4, and now h6 attacking the bishop. What are you going to do to the bishop? We're going to be asking this question. Of course, bishop taking knight means we're going to just develop the rook, simplify the game, make it even easier. Knight g6, knight f4 are all ideas. Knight h3, bishop h3, sacrifice. The queen might be coming as well to put pressure on f3. It's going to be too easy. So after bishop to h4, how to continue? Well, knight to f5 attacking the bishop, and we're going to take the bishop. So if even bishop goes back, that's fine. Knight takes, pawn takes back. This looks very solid though, because the white player just managed to go on to a normal endgame, although black is just better. Black plays now a5. The threat is obviously b5, and then bishop b3, a4 wins a piece. So after a3 providing a shelter, bishop b3, bishop a2 idea, black's best move is bishop to f5. The idea is to start putting pressure on the pawn in e3 because of the future idea of the white player, knight e2 and c4, only move for white that tries to smash, or undermine at least, the control of the center of the white player. But it's just too late, because now after bishop to b3, bishop goes back to h7. This is the best place for our bishop to be. Remember, when your opponent plays a move like h3, stopping you from playing bishop to g4 to pin the knight, your bishop doesn't have to become useless. You just play bishop to f5 and then h7, and the bishop's attacking a very good diagonal. So after knight to e2, trying to go c4, none of this is going to work. Simply a4, attacking the bishop, bishop moves, and now queen to b6 check should win the pawn. Black's position is evaluated as if black was up more or less a piece. So we'll stop this here, and I'll see you in the next video.